He buried his own dream in a wooden box 18 years ago, Chachas, and never told a single soul why. Nobody taught him that melody pause. His gift found him before anyone else did. Every double shift, every missed dream, all so his son would never have to sacrifice his own. One folder. 18 years of silence. And a betrayal his father never once mentioned. 18 years of silence affront, and now, finally, the guitar he never finished is about to speak.
If you have ever loved someone enough to bury your own dream so that theirs could live, this story will break you open and then put you back together. Before we begin, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because you are going to want to see how this story ends, and there is a twist waiting for you that you will not see coming. Stay with me until the last word. Robert Hayes was 41 years old the year his son Ethan turned 9, and by then Robert had already learned that grief does not knock politely before it enters a house. It simply walks in and rearranges the furniture of your life. Robert's wife, Claire, had died 3 years earlier from a sudden illness that the doctors never fully explained, and since that day Robert had raised Ethan alone in a small rented house on the edge of Millbrook, Ohio, a town where the biggest event of the year was the county fair and everybody knew everybody's business whether they wanted them to or not. Before Claire died, before the illness, before the silence that settled over the Hayes house like dust, Robert had a dream that lived in his hands. He was a luthier, a craftsman who built guitars from raw wood, sanding and shaping and stringing instruments that sang like they had souls of their own. He had trained under an old man named Wallace Combs for 6 years, learning the exact curve a spruce top needed to resonate, the patience required to bend, rosewood without cracking it, the almost spiritual quiet of a workshop at midnight, when the only sound was a plane shaving curls off a piece of maple. Robert's dream was simple and enormous at the same time: to open his own guitar shop, a small storefront on Main Street with a sign that would read, Hayes & Sons Handmade Guitars, a name he had chosen years before Ethan was even born, because he always knew somehow that he wanted a family, wanted a legacy, wanted something that would outlive him. He almost got there. At 36, Robert had saved enough, borrowed a little more, and partnered with his closest friend since childhood, a smooth-talking, quick-smiling man named Daniel Voss. Daniel handled the business side, the loans, the paperwork, the vendor, contracts, while Robert built the guitars that would fill the shelves. They signed a lease on Main Street. They ordered wood from Canada and strings from Germany. Robert built 12 guitars by hand that year, each one a small miracle, and he believed, truly believed, that Hayes & Sons was about to become real. Then Claire got sick, and while Robert spent every waking hour beside her hospital bed, Daniel Voss quietly drained the business account, forged Robert's signature on a second loan, and disappeared for what he called an emergency family matter in another state. When Robert finally looked at the books 3 months later, standing in an empty storefront that the landlord had already released to someone else, he discovered that he did not simply lose his business. He was in debt for money he never spent, with his name on paperwork he never signed, and a former best friend who had vanished with everything, including the 12 handmade guitars, which Daniel had sold to a collector in Chicago for cash before he left. Robert never told anyone the full truth, not even his own mother. Grief has a strange way of making a man ashamed of his own bad luck, as if losing everything twice in 1 year was somehow his fault. He told people simply that the shop didn't work out, and that he was focusing on Ethan now. He took a job as a mechanic at Denny's Auto on Route 9, fixing transmissions and brake pads for $11 an hour. And he put his tools, the fine chisels, the bending irons, the tuning gauges that Wallace Combs had left him, into a wooden trunk in the garage, and he did not open that trunk again for a very long time. Claire Hayes had been the one who first suggested the name Hayes & Sons, sitting on the porch of their first rented apartment with her hand resting on her still flat stomach, 3 months pregnant and already certain, in the stubborn way she was certain about most things, that the baby would be a boy who would grow up surrounded by sawdust and music. She used to sit on an overturned crate in the corner of Robert's workshop in the evenings, reading paperback novels while he sanded, occasionally looking up to ask him to play whatever guitar he had just strung. Not because she needed to hear if it was in tune, but because she loved watching his face when an instrument finally worked the way he intended. When she died, 3 years before this story truly begins, Robert did not simply lose a wife. He lost the one person who had ever fully believed in the version of him that built things with his hands. And for a long time after her funeral, he could not walk past the garage without feeling like the workshop itself was mourning alongside him. He kept the porch crate for years, long after it had any purpose, because some part of him could not bring himself to throw away the last place she had sat. Ethan grew up not knowing any of this. What Ethan knew was that his father worked long hours, came home smelling like motor oil, and never once missed a single school recital, even when Ethan was only in the back row of the elementary chorus mumbling through, "This land is your land." What Ethan knew was that his father, despite everything, always found a way to say yes to him. And what Ethan discovered at the age of 10 was that he had a gift. It happened almost by accident. Ethan's fourth-grade music teacher, Mrs. Okafor, had an old, dusty piano in the corner of her classroom that nobody used because it was slightly out of tune and the school could not afford to fix it. One rainy afternoon during recess, Ethan sat down at that piano just to escape the noise of the cafeteria, and his fingers found a melody he did not know he had inside him. Mrs. Okafor heard it from the hallway and stood frozen in the doorway, because what she heard was not a child banging on keys. It was music, real music with shape and feeling, coming from a boy who had never had a single lesson in his life. She called Robert that same evening. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I think your son might be extraordinary. I think you need to get him proper lessons, and I think you need to do it soon because gifts like this do not wait around forever." Robert sat in his kitchen after that phone call for a long time, staring at the wooden trunk he could see through the window, sitting in the garage under a tarp. He thought about Wallace Combs, who used to say that talent without training is a fire with no chimney. It either dies out or it burns the house down. He thought about the 12 guitars that Daniel Voss had stolen and sold, guitars that had once been his own fire with a chimney, finally being built. And he thought about his son's small hands finding music that no one had taught him. The lessons were not cheap. A proper piano teacher in the county cost $40 an hour, and a good one, a serious one. The kind who could actually shape a gift like Ethan's cost far more than that and lived in Columbus, 90 minutes away. Robert did the math more times than he could count, sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread out like a losing hand of cards. He picked up double shifts at the garage. He started fixing neighbors' cars on weekends for cash. He sold his father's old fishing boat, the one thing from his own childhood he had kept, without telling Ethan why the driveway suddenly looked emptier. And finally, on a gray Tuesday in November, Robert opened the wooden trunk in the garage for the first time in 4 years. Inside were the fine chisels, the bending irons, the tuning gauges, and beneath all of it, wrapped in a moving blanket, the 13th guitar, the one Robert had been building the week Claire got sick, the one he never finished, the one Daniel Voss had somehow missed when he cleaned out the shop, because it had been sitting at Robert's own house, not the storefront. It was 90% complete. The body was shaped. The neck was set, but it had never been strung, never been played, never been given a voice. Robert looked at that unfinished guitar for a long time. Then he closed the trunk, drove to a pawn shop in Dayton, and sold every tool inside it. The chisels Wallace Combs had given him on his deathbed, the bending irons he had saved 2 years to afford, everything except the unfinished guitar itself, which he could not bring himself to part with. The pawn shop owner, a weathered man who clearly recognized quality craftsmanship tools when he saw them, offered Robert $800. Robert asked for $1,000. They settled at $950. It was enough, combined with the boat money and the extra shifts, to pay for 6 months of lessons with a teacher in Columbus named Ms. Petrova, a former concert pianist who took one listen to Ethan play and agreed to a reduced rate, because she said she had not heard raw talent like that in 15 years of teaching. Robert drove Ethan to Columbus every single Saturday for the next 8 years. 90 minutes there, 90 minutes back every week, rain or snow or exhaustion, after working a full shift at the garage on Friday night. Some Saturdays, Robert would sit in the car in the parking lot outside Ms. Petrova's studio, rather than pay for parking downtown and walk around, and through the studio's thin walls he would listen to his son's lesson from the sidewalk, arms crossed against the cold, mouthing along to scales he did not understand, but had memorized anyway, just from repetition. Other Saturdays, when the truck's heater broke one particularly brutal January, he wrapped Ethan in 2 blankets for the drive and told him it was an adventure, never once mentioning that he could not yet afford the repair. Ethan, looking back on those years as an adult, would remember them as some of the happiest of his childhood. The radio playing quietly, his father humming along off-key on purpose just to make him laugh, gas station coffee in a paper cup wedged between the seats. He never once suspected those drives were costing his father anything at all. He never told Ethan about the tools. He never told Ethan about the boat, or the guitars, or Daniel Voss, or Hayes and Sons. When Ethan at 13 once asked why there was an empty, unfinished guitar sitting on a shelf in the garage that no one ever touched, Robert simply said, "That one's not for playing. That one's just for looking at," and changed the subject. Years passed, the way years do when you are building something quietly, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. Ethan won a statewide piano competition at 15. At 17, he was accepted into the Cleveland Institute of Music, one of the most competitive conservatories in the country, on a partial scholarship. The partial scholarship still left a gap of nearly $20,000 a year, and Robert, without telling his son, took out a second mortgage on the house they had lived in since Ethan was 6 years old. Ethan thrived at the conservatory. He studied composition and performance, and by his second year, professors were already whispering that he had the kind of talent that comes along once in a generation. He wrote his first original concerto at 19. He performed it himself at a small recital hall in Cleveland, and Robert drove 3 hours in a borrowed car because his own truck had broken down again, and he sat in the third row in his one good shirt, and he cried without shame for the first time since Claire's funeral, because he heard, in his son's music, everything he had never been able to say out loud. Ethan Hayes went on to build a career that exceeded anyone's wildest expectations. By 26, he was a composer of real acclaim, his work performed by regional orchestras, his name appearing in music journals, his original scores licensed for 2 independent films that gained festival attention. He was, by every measure that mattered, living the dream his father had quietly poured everything into. And Robert, now 60, still worked at Denny's Auto 3 days a week, not because he needed to anymore. Ethan had offered many times to support him fully, but because Robert did not know what to do with himself if his hands were not working on something. It was during a visit home, 4 days before Ethan's 27th birthday, that everything changed. Robert had fallen from a ladder while cleaning gutters, a stupid, ordinary accident that turned into a hospital stay when it became clear he had fractured his hip and needed surgery. Ethan flew home immediately, and while Robert was in surgery, Ethan, restless and unable to sit still in a waiting room, drove to his father's house to grab a change of clothes and any paperwork the hospital might need. It was there, digging through a filing cabinet in the garage looking for Robert's insurance card, that Ethan found the wooden trunk. He almost didn't open it. But curiosity, the same curiosity that had once made him sit down at an out-of-tune piano in an empty classroom, pulled his hands toward the latch. Inside, beneath old receipts and a moth-eaten quilt, he found a leather folder. And inside that folder, he found everything his father had never said. There were the original lease documents for Hayes and Sons handmade guitars, dated 18 years earlier. There was a folder of bank statements showing a business account drained to zero within weeks. Statements Robert had kept, Ethan would later understand, not out of nostalgia, but because some wounded part of him needed proof, in case anyone ever accused him of something he did not do. There was a pawn shop receipt for $950, dated the same November that Ethan, at 10 years old, had started lessons with Ms. Petrova. There was a folded newspaper clipping about a highly successful guitar collector and startup investor, a man named Daniel Voss, featured in a Chicago business magazine for founding a chain of boutique music retail stores called Vossworth Strings, now valued, according to the article, at over $11 million. Ethan sat on the cold concrete floor of that garage for almost an hour, the leather folder open on his lap, piecing together a story his father had spent 18 years making sure he never had to know. He understood, finally, why there had been an unfinished guitar sitting untouched on a shelf his entire childhood. He understood why his father's hands, calloused and permanently stained with motor oil, had never once complained about the 90-minute drives to Columbus. He understood that every single opportunity of his life, the lessons, the conservatory, the scholarship gap, all of it, had been paid for not just in money, but in a dream his father had quietly, deliberately, buried alive so that Ethan's dream could breathe. He did not cry at first. He felt something colder than sadness, something closer to fury, sitting in his chest like a stone. Not fury at his father, never that, but fury at a man named Daniel Voss, who had smiled at Robert's wedding, who had stood beside him as a groomsman, who had called himself family, and who had stolen not just money, but an entire alternate version of Robert Hayes's life. A version where Robert might have spent these 18 years building guitars instead of transmissions, might have watched his own name on a storefront instead of a pawn shop receipt. When Robert woke up from surgery, groggy and pale, Ethan was sitting beside his hospital bed holding the leather folder. Robert saw it before Ethan said a single word, and something in his face changed. Not shock exactly, more like the quiet exhale of a man finally setting down something heavy he had carried alone for far too long. "You should have told me," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "Dad, you should have told me what you gave up." Robert was quiet for a long moment. "You had a gift," he finally said. "Gifts don't wait around forever. Mine could wait. It waited 18 years. It could have waited longer." "It shouldn't have had to," Ethan said. "None of it should have happened. Voss stole from you. He didn't just take money, he took your whole life, and you paid for mine instead. And I never even knew to say thank you." "You don't owe me thanks for loving you," Robert said simply. "That's not how it works." "Then what do I owe you?" Ethan asked, and his voice broke on the question in a way that surprised even him, a 26-year-old man who had performed in front of thousands without ever once feeling his hands shake, or suddenly undone in a hospital room by a folder of old receipts. "You gave up everything, the shop, the tools, Dad's boat, all of it, and you never said a word. I grew up thinking we were just a normal family that got unlucky sometimes. I never knew there was a version of you that existed before me, a version that had his own dream, and that I was the reason it got buried." "You weren't the reason it got buried," Robert said, reaching over with the hand that wasn't attached to a foreline, resting it on his son's arm. "Daniel Voss is the reason it got buried. I just decided, once it was already in the ground, to plant something else on top of it, instead of leaving the dirt empty. That's all I did. I didn't lose a dream, Ethan. I traded one for another, and I got the better deal by a long shot. I got to watch you become who you are. Wallace Combs used to tell me a guitar isn't worth anything until somebody plays it. Well, you're the song, son. You always were." Ethan did not sleep that night, sitting in the vinyl recliner beside his father's hospital bed long after Robert had drifted off, turning the leather folder over in his hands, feeling something shift permanently inside him. Not just grief for the years his father had lost, but a fierce, clarifying resolve that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with finally being able to give something back. Ethan did not argue further that night because his father needed rest, and because he did not yet know what he was going to do. But in the weeks that followed, while Robert recovered, Ethan could not stop thinking about the unfinished guitar sitting on the shelf in the garage, and he could not stop thinking about Daniel Voss's smiling face in that magazine clipping, standing in front of a Vossworth Strings flagship store in downtown Chicago. Ethan was not a man built for revenge. He had spent his whole life inside music, inside precision and beauty and discipline, not inside anger. But he had also spent his whole life without knowing it, benefiting from a theft that had never been answered for. So he decided to do the one thing he actually knew how to do well. He decided to find out the truth completely and carefully, and then he decided to make it public in a way that could not be ignored. It took Ethan 4 months of quiet investigation, working with a forensic accountant he hired privately, and a retired detective recommended by a lawyer friend from the conservatory. He told almost no one what he was doing, not even the small circle of musicians he considered his closest friends, because some part of him still felt oddly protective of his father's old wound, as if speaking about it too loudly might reopen something that had only just begun, quietly, to heal. He spent late nights after rehearsal scrolling through digitized county business records, cross-referencing old lease filings with bankruptcy court documents, building a timeline that stretched back nearly 2 decades. He drove to Dayton one weekend and sat across from the same pawn shop owner, now much older, who still remembered. The fella who sold a whole trunk of fine woodworking tools for almost nothing looked like his heart had been ripped clean out of his chest while he did it. He tracked down the original landlord of the Main Street storefront, now retired in Florida, who confirmed over a crackling phone line that the lease had indeed been re-signed within weeks of Robert's disappearance from the property, and that a man matching Daniel Voss's description had personally handled the paperwork to break the original lease early, using power of attorney documents that, on closer inspection by the forensic accountant, appeared to have been signed with a signature that did not match any known sample of Robert's actual handwriting. What they found was worse than even Robert had known. Daniel Voss had not simply drained one business account. He had used the same forged signature scheme in slightly different forms on at least two other small business partners over the following decade, always timing his exits around moments when his partners were distracted by personal crises, an illness, a divorce, a death in the family. He had built Vossworth Strings not from his own vision, but from a foundation of other people's stolen dreams, repeated like a pattern, like a man who had found a formula for cruelty and simply kept using it. Ethan did not go to the media first. He went to Robert. He sat his father down at the kitchen table, the same table where Robert had once done math on bills spread out like a losing hand of cards, and he laid out everything the investigation had found, not just what Voss had done to Robert, but to two other families since. "I want to make this right," Ethan said, "not for revenge, for justice, for every family he did this to, including ours. But I won't do anything without you saying yes first. This is your story before it's mine." Robert looked at the folder for a long time. Then he looked at his son, this man who had built an entire career out of music, out of beauty, out of everything Robert had sacrificed to protect, and he nodded. "Do it right," he said. "Not with anger. With the truth. The truth is enough." Ethan used his public platform carefully and deliberately. He gave one long, honest interview to a respected business journalism outlet, laying out the documented evidence. Bank records, forged signatures verified by a handwriting analyst, and testimony from the two other betrayed business partners who came forward once they learned they were not alone. He did not frame it as a celebrity scandal story. He framed it as what it was, a pattern of financial fraud against small business owners, verified with hard evidence, presented soberly and without exaggeration. Within a week, the story was picked up by larger outlets. Within a month, the state attorney general's office had opened a formal investigation into Vossworth Strings' financial history. Within 6 months, Daniel Voss had settled restitution claims with all three families rather than face a fraud trial, and Vossworth Strings' brand, once a symbol of clean success, collapsed under public scrutiny and investor withdrawal. Robert Hayes received a restitution settlement that year that, finally, 18 years later, closed the books on Hayes and Sons. But the money was almost beside the point by then. What mattered more happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon a few weeks later, when Ethan drove to his father's garage, pulled the tarp off the old shelf, and lifted down the unfinished 13th guitar, the one that had sat untouched for 18 years, the one Robert always said was just for looking at. "Finish it," Ethan said, setting it gently on the workbench. "You still remember how. I know you do." Robert's hands trembled as he held it, feeling the smooth curve of the body he had shaped nearly 2 decades. Earlier, the neck he had set with such care the week before Claire's diagnosis had changed everything. It took him 3 weekends, working slowly, relearning the muscle memory in fingers. That had spent 18 years turning wrenches instead of shaping wood. But he finished it. He strung it. He tuned it, adjusting the intonation with the same patient care Wallace Combs had once taught him, and when he finally played the first chord on that guitar, the very first sound it had ever made in its entire existence, both he and Ethan sat in the quiet garage and listened to 18 years of silence finally break. 6 months later, Robert Hayes opened a small storefront on Main Street. In Millbrook, a modest shop with a hand-painted sign above the door. That read Hayes & Sons Handmade Guitars, exactly the name he had. Chosen decades before, back when the dream was young and unbroken. Ethan funded the lease, not as charity, but as partnership, insisting on it, saying it was long overdue interest on a debt only he could see. Robert builds guitars there now 3 days a week, teaching 2 local teenagers the same careful craft Wallace Combs once taught him, making sure, this time, that the fire has a proper chimney. Ethan still tours. He still composes. But every single one of his concert programs, no matter the city, no matter the size of the orchestra, carries a single line printed at the bottom of the credits page. In honor of Robert Hayes, who sold his own dream so mine could live, and who taught me that some debts are worth spending a lifetime repaying. What Robert Hayes gave up was real. What Daniel Voss stole was real. And what it took to make both of those truths visible, after 18 years of silence, was not vengeance, but a son's simple refusal to let his father's sacrifice remain invisible forever. Some fathers give up their dreams quietly and never ask for anything in return. But if you are lucky enough to find out what your own father gave up for you, do not let that silence stand. Say thank you while he can still hear it. Because the truest kind of love is the kind that never once asked to be noticed, and the truest kind of gratitude is the kind that finally notices it anyway. If this story moved you even a little, you already know what to do. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and tell us in the comments what you would do if you found out what your own parents quietly gave up for you. Thank you for watching until the very end, and we will see you in the next story.